Welcome, everybody. My name is Kjetil Storesletten. As the director of the Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. The mission of the Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute is to build a bridge between the leading-edge economic research that takes place here at this university and policymakers, community members, government officials, and the broader public who can benefit from that research. We fulfill that mission through events like this, as well as other public-focused communications, including the Office Hours podcast, which you, by the way, should tune into, and investing in rigorous research done by top University of Minnesota economists and students. We're excited to welcome you to this event, which promises to be very interesting. I think we have gathered academics, policymakers, journalists, students, and other interested parties. And I would like to extend a especially welcome to the members of the Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute board who are here tonight and provide critical support to help us advance our mission. Along with those in the room, we also have many guests tuning in virtually. Thank you all for being here. The topic today is a slow-moving crisis. Can there be such a thing as a slow-moving crisis? We have the aging population. Fertility is falling like a rock. At the same time, at the moment, the federal government is, for each $5 the federal government collects in taxes, it spends $6. Are we screwed? Professor Hannes Malmberg and Professor Jesús Fernández Villaverde from University of Pennsylvania, who happen, by the way, to be a proud alumni, is going to inform us about that today. Our moderator is going to be Dr. Julie Bunn, Executive Director of the Minnesota Council of Economic Education, and also one of our distinguished board members. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fernández Villaverde to the stage.
Okay, thank you. It's a real honor to be here. First, as Kjetil was mentioning before, I'm indeed an alumnus of Minnesota from 1996 to 2001, which were probably some of the best 5 years of my life. And it's really... And it's a double pleasure to be in this event on the Heller-Hurwicz Institute. Walter Heller, as many of you probably know, was a very dedicated public servant, something that we need more of these days. And more close to me, Leo Hurwicz. Leo Hurwicz was not only an incredible economist, a fantastic person. He was my teacher in the first year in micro, but also he was fundamental in bringing Spanish students to Minnesota in the late 1960s, and the very long tradition of Spanish economists that took me here in 1996 traces back to Leo. And I will all my life be very, very deeply thankful for him. And one of my biggest regrets in life is that I never had the chance to really express my sincere gratitude. Having said that, let me tell you a little bit about a lot of stuff I have been working on over the last few years. Although to tell you the truth, already chapter 1 of my dissertation was about this, about fertility and demographics. The standard story that I would have told you in 1997 was the story of the demographic transition. You go back in human history, and for most of human history, both birth and death rates were very high. So in this graph, you can see that as a stage 1. You will have around 40 per thousand births in a population in a year, around 35, 36 deaths per thousand. This will fluctuate, but you will basically have a very, very slow population growth. Then something interesting happens some moment in the early 19th century in advanced economies like the United Kingdom. The birth rate started going down. Sorry, the death rate, while the birth rate still stayed high. After a while, think about 1870, the birth rate also started going down. And the idea was that in the middle, you are going to have this very, very large process of population growth in the middle, and that we were going to somehow stabilize at a new level of low birth and low death rates. And that was the standard story you will learn if you were going to take a simple class in population economics. When I was an undergrad in my freshman year in college, I took a class in Introduction to Demographics, and they showed me exactly this graph. Turns out to be the case, the world has not turned out to be as my professors told me. The total fertility rate, and don't worry, I will tell you in a second what total fertility rate is, has been dropping. We already knew it was dropping, and we expected that it was going to drop. What is new and unexpected is how fast it has been dropping since around 2016. And it has been dropping everywhere. Today is not a talk about the United States. Today is not a talk about advanced economies. Today is not a talk about the Western world. It's a talk about the whole of humanity. In fact, 2023 may have been a landmark year in the history of humanity. Because for the very first time in our human history, in the around 200,000 years we have been on this planet, humans' global fertility rate has fallen below replacement rate. And I will tell you in a second what the replacement rate means. There is strong evidence, furthermore, that this drop is being faster in middle and poor income countries, and that is dropping below the level of fertility in middle and poor income countries. Since I don't have a lot of time today, I may focus a little bit more on the United States, but you really want to keep this in mind. This is not about the United States. In fact, the United States is an outlier in terms of having a surprisingly high fertility rate. This has three consequences. Consequence number one, peak birth. The year in the history of humanity where most kids were born was probably 2012. With around 138 million babies being born on the planet. In 2025, the data is still not completely in, but my guesstimate is that it will be has been around 120 million. So 18 million children less in just 14 years. 18 million is a lot of people. Second, that the world population will start falling around 2055. Even when fertility rate is below replacement, it takes a little bit of time before population falls. This is known as momentum. And it just means, imagine that I have 4 kids, and each of my kids only have half a kid on average, but I'm still alive. Well, that means that until I die, population is still growing, even if my kids are not producing enough grandkids to replace me. And finally, and this is the point that I want to really emphasize today, is that this is not a situation where I need to make a wild guess about how the world is going to look like when we fast forward 30 or 40 years, because that world already exists, and it's called Japan. And the planet, or at least a good chunk of the planet, is going to look a lot in 2055 as Japan looks like today. And we can draw very important lessons, especially in the context of today's talk regarding fiscal policy. So I mentioned before 2 concepts that now we need to define carefully: the total fertility rate and the replacement rate. The total fertility rate is the average number of children that a woman will have over her lifetime at current age-specific fertility rates. This is different from completed fertility, which is the fertility of women that have already completed their fertility age. The problem is, unfortunately, completed fertility comes by its very nature with only 20-30 years delay. You have probably then heard also about the replacement rate, which is the number of children that we need to keep a population constant. And you may have seen in the media that a number that is often mentioned is 2.1. That's true for the US. It turns out to be the case it's not true for the rest of the planet. So what is the replacement rate? It's a very simple fraction. On the numerator, you have 1 plus the sex ratio at birth. which in a population with any type of outside intervention is around 1.05. That means there are 105 boys born for each 100 girls. There are probably good evolutionary reasons for that. Boys tend to be silly enough to kill themselves when they are in their teenage years, so a population needs to produce a few more boys. In the denominator, we have the probability that a woman will survive to 30, which is the midpoint of her fertility age. So why 2.1? Well, very simple. Imagine we have 100 women. They will have 210 babies. 107, 108 will be boys. 102, 103 will be girls. 2 of these girls will not get to 30. You will have 100 women that will have again 210 babies. And that's why the replacement rate is 2.1. But turns out to be the case that this is not the case for the planet. First of all, because the sex ratio is not 1.05 in many countries. The best example is China and India. There is a lot of selective abortions that pushes the sex ratio at birth at around 1.15. Second, unfortunately, a lot of women do not survive to 30. When you do the numbers, you get that for a country with enormous amount of selective abortions like Pakistan and relatively high mortality, the replacement rate is 0.33. And when you do this for the whole planet, turns out to be the case is 2.2. Well, the world total fertility rate in 2024, according to my calculations, is 2.17. 2.2 is higher than 2.17. This is not advanced math. That means we are already below replacement rate. How has this evolved over time? These are numbers for the world population projection of the United Nations. And you can see that the total fertility rate was very, very high in the 1950s, around 5. This was the time where people were writing books about the big population explosion. But most demographers and most people in population economics already guess that the total fertility rate was going to start dropping very fast, exactly as in the demographic transition of the very first slide I showed you. And you can see how we went from 5 all the way over here around 2. And you see how the thing stabilized over here? And we thought, well, so if you stop me in 2005, you walk through campus at Penn, and you say, oh, Jesus, what do you think is going to happen? I will have to say, well, this is going to kind of continue like this. And we will very gently get to 0.21. But you see what happens here? Let me blow up for you. It starts going down. Now, the United Nations is making projections that this is kind of a slowdown again. I don't believe those for a second. Because everything that we are seeing is that this is going down and down and down. This is just, trying to keep the forecast as conservative or cautious as possible. And this, as I was saying before, around 2016, is what has changed everything. Now, I wanted to tell you that this is not about the US. This table includes countries that satisfy 2 characteristics. 1, they have lower fertility rate than the US. 2, they are substantially poorer than the US. So this is not a story about rich countries stopping having kids. This is a story about of lower and middle-income countries having kids. For 2024, the US total fertility rate is 1.62. The numbers for 2025 just came up the other day is 1.57, subject to final revisions. Dominican Republic, 1.61. Tunisia, 1.56. I picked Tunisia because it's a country of Muslim majority to make the point this is happening everywhere in the world, including in the Middle East and North Africa. Mexico, 1.55. Okay, this is amazing. The fertility rate of non-Hispanic whites, okay, non-Hispanic whites in the US is right now around 1.57. The fertility rate of Mexicans in Mexico is 1.55. I dare you to go to campus, randomly stop 10 professors and ask them, who do you think has a higher fertility, Mexicans or non-Hispanic whites? Turkey, 1.48. Brazil, I'm not going to go over all of them except when I get to the bottom. Chile, 1.03. Thailand, 0.98. And I stopped there because I ran out of space. But I could have another 20 examples. And again, it's not that Thailand has low fertility. It's that it's dropping like a stone. This is what I think is going to happen with the total fertility rate of different countries. The blue line is the fertility rate in a country like the US. We started falling very, very early and stabilized, let's say, around 1.6, 1.7. Then you are going to have middle-income economies that will start falling later and stabilize even later. And then you have the low-income economies, and they will stabilize even lower. So if I were going to make a bold forecast, I wouldn't be surprised if in the year 2050 or 2060, the country in the planet with the highest fertility is the United States. How important is this? Well, think about what I have called with some success the rule of 85. The highest life expectancy in the world right now is in South Korea and Spain, around 85 years. If a country has 1,000 births per year, every year, and somehow we are able to stabilize at 1,000 births, what is going to be your population in the long run? 85,000. That means that as a very simple back-of-the-envelope calculation, you can do the following. I can go to Colombia. Colombia had, oh, sorry, this is a mistake. It should say South Korea, not Colombia. South Korea had 255,000 births in 2026. That means that the long-run population of South Korea, if they are able to keep that number of births over time, which they will not because their fertility rate is below replacement, will be 21.6 million. Their current population is 51.6. That just gives you a sense of the magnitude. So the current fertility rate of South Korea is 0.8, 0.79. Let me give you an easy way to think about it. Let's imagine a high school with 100 students, the graduating class. And this is the ultimate romantic high school where we create 50 couples. A fertility rate of 0.8 means that out of those 50 couples, you are only going to have 40 kids. So 100 parents, 40 kids. The next generation in the high school will have 40 kids. But the school is going to be very, very romantic still, and they are going to form 20 couples. The next one will have 16. So in 2 generations, we will go from a high school of 100 students to a high school of 16 students. That's what a fertility rate of 0.6 means. Okay, but you're probably thinking, Jesus, this is the Heller-Hurwicz Institute of Economics, not of education policy, although, of course, education has direct implications for economics. So let me tell you about the unpleasant arithmetic that this is going to have in terms of long-term growth. There is a basic accounting identity. And by identity, I mean this is not a model. This is true by definition. That says the following. Output growth is going to be, or the rate of output growth is going to be equal to the rate of labor productivity growth plus the rate of growth of labor. Let's think about the way we were in 2000 when I was a graduate student over here. At that year, the US, on average, will grow at around 3%. Why? Because it turns out to be the case that the long-run productivity growth in the economy in the US has been around 2%, a little bit less, 1.9, but let's round it up. And population was growing at around 1%, labor force. Around that time, 50% of that 1% were the fact that the US still had relatively high fertility and there were people being born in the US, and the other 50% is because the US was letting immigrants with funny accents like me, like mine, in. Well, let's fast forward to 2050. Let's imagine that productivity growth is still 2%, which is a tall order. We are going to be talking about a very aged society with not a lot of young people as innovators. But let me take this in a cautious way. If labor force is falling 1%, it means that we are going to grow at a 1%. That's it. There is absolutely nothing whatsoever that the Federal Reserve System or the federal government can do about it. Kevin Walsh, if he's ever confirmed, can go to the street and dance, pray to the heavens, candle a light to Our Lady of the Miracles. The growth will be 1% on average. The federal government can try to use fiscal policy, whatever, it will be 1%. And you're saying, I don't believe you, and I will tell you, that means you are not looking at the data. One of my favorite papers is about this precisely. It's with Gustavo Ventura and one of my former students, Wen Yao. And we do something very simple. This is my favorite table from the paper. We look at the growth rate of the main market economies in the world, basically G7 plus Spain, the main market-rich economies, I should have said, and look at the first row, is GDP. And you see over there the standard story that you have seen many, many times. Oh, the US grew 2.58 and Japan grew 0.83. The US is doing something right, Japan is doing something wrong. And then economists go and spend 25 years thinking about what Japan did wrong. And we say, no, the economists got it wrong, not Japan. Because what we say is now let's take account of the fact that the population, the working age adults in the US were growing 0.91% on average, while in Japan they were falling at 0.54. And guess what? When you correct from that, basically the US is still doing a little bit better, but basically they are doing the same. In fact, if you take 1990 to 1995, which were the years where Japan was digesting the aftermath of the real estate bubble, Japan has been doing better than the US. That's why I think the future is going to look like Japan. And every single paper that has been written on this topic is absolutely useless, because this is just about demographics. Demographics is destiny. We can talk a little bit about immigration, but I really want to spend in time. Maybe we can keep this to the Q&A. A concluding thought is, everything we have seen is that we are entering into a new world. That fertility and births are falling much faster than anyone anticipated. This is completely rearranging the economy. This is completely changing. I also do something called geoeconomics, which is the intersection of economics and grand power politics. Just think about the fact that right now, there are around 2.5 more births in India than in China, and fast forward the relative position of China and India in the world stage in the year 2100. And to borrow from a great economist who was never at the University of Minnesota, but that was a great friend of the department and spent a lot of time at the Minneapolis Fed, Bob Lucas, once you start thinking about these issues, it is hard to think about anything else. Thank you.
And then I'd like to welcome Professor Hans Malmberg from University of Minnesota.
Thank you very much. So I'm an assistant professor here, have been working on issues related to demography, has received a lot of support from the Heller-Hurwicz Foundation for my research, so I'm very grateful to be here today. And I will give the local version of Jesus's global story about the end of US population growth. And when you look at population growth, the US is really special. If you go back to 1900 and you look at the large Western economies, they're roughly the same size. The US is there at 75 million, down to France at 40 million. Fast forward until today, the US is at 340 million people, and France is at 65. So the story of the US is really a story about population growth. It doesn't get better if you go back in time. In 1800, there were 5 million people in the US. But the best recent estimates suggest that this era is coming to a close. Here you see the projection from the Congressional Budget Office that came out this January. It's just going to flatten out. I will talk about two consequences today. First, fiscal pressure. The fiscal strategy of the US has been to use large incoming generations to pay for small outgoing generations. That strategy will no longer work. I will spend most of my time on this fiscal question, give you some numbers, but as you see, it's a big part of the American story with population growth. So I will spend a little bit time at the end discussing what you can loosely talk about as dynamism. But let's start with the fiscal stuff. And before looking at the future, let's look where we are coming from. How has the US government been receiving revenue? How has they been spending during the post-war years? And this is how it looks. And what you see here is that the revenue of the federal government is remarkably stable as a share of GDP per capita. All through the post-war years, the federal government takes about 18% of our money, give and take. Unfortunately, we can't say the same about spending, especially when it comes to the last few decades, where spending has been trending up. And currently, our primary expenditures are at 21.1%, so we have a 3.5% deficit. If you include local and state governments, you don't get that different of a picture. And note that these things don't even include the interest payment on the debt. And I will get back to that issue later. Beyond these aggregate numbers, there is also a big shift in composition. If you go back to the 1950s, the federal government spends its money on military and a little bit of highways on the side. That's not true anymore. The big spending category now is health and transfers, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, primarily. And this is very important for the aging story because these are programs that are disproportionately geared towards the elderly. One way you can see that is that you can ask, how much do these programs spend on an average American of different ages? And it's not super straightforward to calculate it, but when you do a best effort and crunch the numbers, this is how it looks. So on the x-axis, we have age. On the y-axis, we have how much an average American receives from these programs. For a 40-year-old, we're talking about $2,500 for the average American, primarily from Medicaid. When you look at an 80-year-old American, it's above $40,000, and it keeps increasing. What this means is that as the US population is aging, there will be big spending pressures. One experiment you can run is, let's focus on this. Let's keep the other stuff fixed. Let's keep taxes as a share of GDP fixed. Let's keep defense and all other programs as a share of GDP fixed. And let's just take this age profile and roll forward that Congressional Budget Office prediction for the age structure of the population. How does the deficit situation look? And here is the answer. When we go to the end of the century, spending just goes up and up and up as more people go into those high spending ages. And by 2100, we have opened up a deficit of 12% of GDP. Now, 2100 is an awful long time away, and who knows what's going to happen then. So I will be a little bit more conservative. I'm going to go back to 2060. That's like 1991 until today. So you can think that we're sitting here in 1991, and then it doesn't feel that far away to think what's going to happen today. And then this gap will be 7% of GDP. And to put these numbers in context, I find it helpful to translate them into policies. So what does it take to close a 7% deficit in 1960? Well, one idea is that let's go on the revenue side, increase payroll taxes, plus 14 percentage points, no income limits. We can do the other way around and go on the spending side. It's helpful because entitlement spending is very big now, so we get more bang for the cuts, but we still need to cut by 50% to close that gap. Or we can consider new policy options altogether and go for sales taxes. A national sales tax would have to be 12%. And these numbers, they're not, I would say, insane. Like if you cut all those numbers in 3, you can almost see it as a program. That doesn't look crazy. But it would be large tax rises on the middle class and large cuts to popular programs. And if anything, these numbers are a little bit on the optimistic side, because remember, this is without the interest payments. And if there's one thing I'm sure of is that even if an adjustment happens, it will not happen tomorrow. And the longer we postpone it, the more the debt will increase. So we can go back to those figures I showed on the previous slide, and let's just roll forward and see where the debt goes while we're waiting. Then you get this picture. So if you try to wait until 2060, the federal government debt would be at 249% if you do this with constant real interest rates. How bad is this? Well, then we go into the big unknown. Where will interest rates go? And I've done research on this, but I'm still pretty uncertain. So that's going to be the key unknown. One silver lining actually is that even though old people get a lot of government spending made on them, they also love holding assets because they're very wealthy after they save all their lives. So having a lot of old people actually means higher demand for government debt. When you go through the numbers, maybe 100% of GDP, more asset demand. So that might create some breathing space, but the big uncertainty is, yeah, they want to hold assets, but do they really want to hold US debt on the current trajectory? And here I think we should just be very honest that we don't really know how much debt the market is willing to absorb. It depends on expectations, what they believe the fiscal trajectory will be. But what we can do is that we can plug in some numbers and see what comes out. So I'm going to show you 2 experiments. One is that if you increase the government debt by 100 percentage points, interest rate goes up 1 percentage point. The other, that they go up 2. Now you think that might even be optimistic, but I will show you that even that is actually going to be pretty bad. So what happens if you run those experiments? Well, the first thing that happens is that you end up with a much higher debt level as you're waiting. And the reason is that you get a positive feedback loop. You accumulate more debt, interest rate starts rising, the deficit becomes bigger, and you accumulate debt even faster. So that's why you get this quadratic curve. And the top line there ends up at 478% in debt. And the problem with that scenario is that now the debt is much higher, but the way it got that much higher is that the interest rates are also much higher. And when you put those things together, that scenario will feature real interest rate costs of 42% of GDP. I mean, we won't get there because you would have defaulted before you go there. So the message is that there is an adjustment that needs to be made that is big, but not impossible. But if you just let it linger and the market just gets a little bit queasy, starts to demand a few percentage points higher rate of return, that's the road to bankruptcy. So something should probably be done. How to think about that? And I like to think about fiscal crisis, even slow-moving ones, as who to make disappointed. And Tom Sargent, one of the greatest economists ever to have worked here at the University of Minnesota, he said that a fiscal crisis is that a bunch of promises were made by the government, and the question is, whose promises are going to be broken? And there is what you can call benign solution to this problem that is also very boring. You just pay your way. You can almost see the program from the things I showed before. You raise some taxes, you cut some benefits, and importantly, you communicate it in advance so that people can adjust their behavior. They can save more, they can work for longer, they can talk with their kids that they should save more and pay for medical care, all those adjustments that need to be made. And Ellen McGraden here and the late Ed Prescott, they worked through these different policies and said, if you do it well, you don't have to hit any one group particularly hard. I mean, people will be moderately disappointed all across the board, but it's not the end of the world. There are other things that would help. Immigration, especially high-skilled immigration, because we have progressive taxes. Productivity growth in medical care, or just in general as well. But we sort of have the contours of how you could solve this problem. But of course, this is not high up on the agenda. Democrats don't like raising taxes either nowadays, other than the very rich. Republicans, they like to cut taxes, and they also have started to like these transfer programs. So we should also see what the risks are. And I think that there are some big risks. I think the first one is that we're going to quietly hollowing out vital spending. And we can sort of see that a little bit, that over time, this spending has crowded out a lot of other government spending. And we can keep doing that. We can stop maintaining the infrastructure. We can stop doing R&D. We can stop funding public universities. And that won't kill you in the short run, but it can be very bad in the long run. The second thing is that you don't want to face reality, and then you have to face reality very quickly. And that's problematic, because then people can't prepare. You're 80 years old, you can't work any longer, you thought you were getting Social Security, boom, cut in half. That's also very problematic. But the third, and I would argue based on historical experience, maybe the most dangerous path, is that fiscal policy will simply get erratic. And what I mean by that is that if we look at the history of governments that are cash-strapped, they sometimes start behaving like wounded animals that lash out in the chase for revenue. You inflate away the debt. Then no one wants to hold the debt. Then you try to force them to hold the debt. Then they desperately try to invest in something else, then you're inflating debt. Then you have to start regulating investment. You have to start banning investment. You have to have investment boards deciding what investments you can do. Argentina started nationalizing pension funds. You can do a lot of stuff before you decide that maybe I should just raise the VAT by 10 percentage points. And these things are often much worse than increasing taxes. If we just have slightly higher sales taxes and payroll taxes, there are distortions associated with that, and people in this room could give you numbers. And we would all have to consume a little bit less, but once you do that, you can get on with your life. But what happens when governments don't want to do that, and instead rely on tricks like inflation, regulation, one-off levies, is that in the end, a lot of national life starts revolving around what the next trick will be. And that can be very paralyzing for an economy. So that was the thing I wanted to say about fiscal policy. So the main message is hard choices, not impossible choices, but very big risks if you don't do them. And I promised a little bit beyond the fiscal and talking about population growth and dynamism. And as an immigrant to this country who's benefited a lot from that dynamism, this is an issue that is close to my heart. And the basic observation is that in the end, population growth is nothing less than that each new generation is larger than the generation that came before. That means that your country will be young, in a literal sense, that there will be a lot of young people around, but also those large new generations, they will need new houses, new cities, new companies, and maybe even new ideas. Western Europe does not have a Miami or a Phoenix, a place, and maybe that's a good thing, but a place that barely existed at the beginning of last century and now has more than 5 million people. Just doesn't exist. And that's just a special case of a very general rule, which is that if you have rapid population growth, then the past matters less. For the simple reason that all those generations that came before you, they're pretty small compared to the present. And if population is stagnating, the past becomes more important because all those past generations are pretty big compared to the present. And it's not that one of those things is good or bad. It's nice in France that medieval villages loom so large over the landscape and can accommodate a high share of the population. But I think from the perspective of the United States, throughout its history, I think it's been a big part of US identity that the country belongs on the left-hand side of this slide and not on the right-hand side. So I think that now when population growth is slowing down, this is something to keep in mind about the character of the country. So to sort of wrap up then, the era of US population growth is coming to a close. We will see sharp rises in fiscal pressure, and we might also risk sort of lower dynamism in general in the country. So thank you very much and look forward to the discussion.
Good evening. We're going to continue now and a series of questions, which to begin with, I want to just kind of go deeper into the points you've already made, and then we'll expand to more policy implications in the second half. But first of all, both of you, at least today, Jesus, and in other writings of yours, Hannes, have talked about the Japan being the poster child for what our future looks like. Come on, economy high in debt, aging population, but still surprisingly low interest rates. I want you to explain for the audience here what Japanization would actually feel like on kind of a daily, monthly, yearly basis in the years ahead. Is it a stable, slow motion decline, or is a funk that eventually limits our policy options so severely that we're in a national crisis?
So so how does Japan feel? Well, we can go to Japan and take a look. So it is a country that is still a very high income per capita country. It's still a country that is very well run. And it's a country that, more than anything, especially outside Tokyo, there is just not a lot of opportunities. There is not a lot of exciting things. There is not a lot of things that young people can aspire to. On the other hand, I think that by picking Japan, we are also looking at a best case scenario. Two ideas. Idea number one, actually Japan has put a good chunk of its fiscal house in order. Something that has gone very underreported in the Western media is that Japan in 2007 undertook a very, very deep reform of its social security system to make it more sustainable in the long run, introducing a version of national accounts. We haven't done that. And one can wonder if these type of reforms are actually possible in countries that are not Japan, that do not have a high culture of consensus and serious policy reform. The second thing that maybe Japan can get away with is that when you are a small open economy like Japan, to a very large extent, the interest rate at which you borrow is the interest rate of the planet. And a few less Japanese doesn't really change that. But what we can go is to a situation, for whatever the reason, the world interest rate goes up, and that's going to be very different for Japan than now. So in that sense, I think that Japan feels to a large extent like an economy that doesn't grow much, that doesn't have a lot of exciting opportunities to young people, but that has been able to manage the transition reasonably well. Do I think that Western European countries are managing the transition as well as Japan did? No, and I can tell you plenty of examples. Do I think that Colombia, Mexico, or Tunisia, countries with very low state capability, countries with very poisonous political economies, are going to be able to handle that transition as well as Japan? Not in a million years.
Yeah, no, I can, does it work?
I think you could go to the box and see if the green light's on.
It is on.
Okay, that should work.
Okay. Yeah, I share many of Jesus's comments. I think that if you take the benign scenario that I put out, you can sort of see, yeah, the US will be a slightly higher taxed economy than it is today. It will be slightly less generous welfare state. It doesn't look as dramatic. It's though a little bit of the reason I put in this dynamism side as well, that what would be true is that it would be an economy where old firms were much more important than young firms, and essentially old people were much more important in politics than young people. And I think that those things, it's one of those things that are slightly harder to quantify in economics, but I think it can give a different tenor to it in many respects. And I think you see that a little bit in Japan, that if you look at, I mean, Japan, of course, still has many successful companies. A lot of people drive Toyotas and Hondas here. But if you look at the AI race, for example, it's very different from how you thought in the 80s, that like Japan was the frontier of the world where all the exciting technological stuff was happening. That does not feel like the case anymore. It's hard to quantify how much that has to do with aging, how much that has to do with other things. But it's definitely a pattern that I notice when I see it.
Before we get to the likelihood of various other policy options or events improving the outlook for the pacing of approaching a crisis or really difficult decisions, I wanted to play out the worst case scenario. And you did that some in your big risk section, Hannes. So I want to give you an opportunity to add to that if in fact political momentum is so inert such that in our system we just can't, these decisions are not made in any timely fashion, and in fact they don't choose to adopt these policy solutions, the three main ones, any combination of three ones, what's the outcome? What's the worst case scenario?
Yeah.
What happens?
So going into a little bit econ science fiction speculation, but if you think about the path ahead, what would happen first would be that at some stage people start seeing those graphs, they listen to US political debates, and they start thinking that what I talked about will actually happen. That the US will start locking you in, that if you ever bought a bond, you can never sell it again. Maybe they want outright default, maybe they put a very high tax on selling US bonds or whatever to keep people from running away from them. Probably triggered by interest rates going up, and then you try to keep interest rate down. The Fed starts printing money to buy up those bonds to save the bond market. You start getting a lot of inflation. And that would be the first thing. And then more financial regulation because you try to prevent the inflation. People will start blaming that it's the groceries that is wrong and we have to have price regulation on groceries. That already happened in the last thing. So often what happens is inflation, it's sort of bad. The downstream consequences when people try to hide the causes of inflation are sometimes even worse than the inflation. I can go on, but that would be, but I would add one thing that is important though, is that sometimes countries just stop paying their debt. And I think one thing that makes the US very vulnerable here is that it's not the interest rate payments that is screwing over the US. It's the primary deficit. Without interest payments, you're in a deficit. If your problem is that you took on a lot of credit card debt, but otherwise you're fine, it's very simple. You just declare bankruptcy and hope for the best. And then if your creditors are kind, you're good. What we're looking at the US is that you have like 3% of GDP now, 7% of GDP soon, that you just like don't take in enough taxes to pay the expenditures. So when the creditor says it's out, we don't want to lend to you anymore, and you say like, fine, I'm not going to pay, you still have a big hole to plug. And then you just have to cut spending now. And that's very traumatic, I think, for a country to go through.
Jesus, did you want to add to that dismal outlook?
Yes, I like to add the loop of how this is going to poison politics. Okay, so you go to Europe, and basically any European country, and you divide the population between those who are over 50 and people who are under 50. And you look at which political parties they vote. Now, in the US is a little bit different because there are only two main political parties. In Europe, we usually have many of them. But if you look at the voting of population over 50, they are basically voting to the parties that say we are going to keep everything in the same way it is. And everyone under 50 is voting for parties who are saying we are going to blow up everything. Which means that you go to the Spanish parliament where you have both type of parties and basically they insult each other for 4 hours. Which means that politics is impossible. There is nothing you can do. And it's exactly the same in France, it's exactly the same in Italy, it will soon very be the same in Germany. In the US, it will play differently because of the two-party structure, but this is going to basically transform all politics in the US on fights between those below 50 and those above 50.
Well, that's an excellent segue into my next question, is if you take Hannes' suggestion for a benign, let's say relatively benign policy mix of, some payroll taxes, some cutting entitlements, some, maybe a VAT tax or a sales tax, and a relatively benign one. The question is to Jesus, can you look internationally, Japan or the European countries who are ahead of us on this transition, have they effectively adopted such benign packages? And if not, or not to a great enough extent, what are the main barriers to the adoption?
Okay, so I think there are two examples of countries that have adopted a lot of the right policies. The first one, not surprising, are Scandinavian countries, and in particular, countries like Sweden, and I mentioned also Japan before, the introduction of national accounts. The idea of a national account is that your social security benefits will be automatically indexed to the growth of the economy and to the demographic structure of the economy. If you do this right, you can make the system sustainable over time. Now, what is the problem? The problem of this type of national accounts is that over time, they will result in lower benefits, and voters do not like that. So we actually introduced this system in Spain in 2013. 2021, we have an election, and one party ran on, let's scrap this. And they won, and we scrap it. And, we decided to celebrate by making the person who completely screwed up the governor of the central bank to be absolutely sure that we reward incompetence. So the point is the US going to look like Sweden, or is the US going to look like Spain? Do you like him more than you like me?
No, and I think I can share some perspective from Sweden on that, because we did a big pension reform in the 1990s, which had exactly that flavor, which meant that the national wage growth indexed the size of the pie, and then mechanically, if you work longer, you divide with fewer years, you get more. And I can say that even in Sweden, that is a more consensus-oriented country, there are a lot of strains in this, because as aging hits, wage growth does go down, and then that thing starts happening. They start cutting pensions. And then they start doing patches and maybe cut taxes for retirees and so forth. And I think it's important to remember also in this being not just a fiscal issue, is that it's like a physical issue in the sense that if there are a lot of people who don't work and young people who do work, there's just less resources to go around. Like you lost something and there's no way. So sometimes it's like, it's not just if you have more rational politics, well, you maybe want rational politics, but it's like something has to give here because what we eat today has to be produced today. You can store some capital, you can store some tin food, I guess, but in the end, the thing we consume today is produced today. And if there's fewer people producing it, there's just less to go around, and I think that sometimes the hope in Sweden is that you sort of fit in with the fiscal system, but when it really hits you that no, it's a physical constraint, we are getting poorer because of this, then that does create strain. And it's not impossible, I mean, it does happen. I think that the thing that can also happen is that we just start gradually to work longer. People are much more healthy today than they used to be. That's also a big thing that happened in Sweden, that essentially they sent you the very orange envelope every year and said, if you stop working then, this is what you get. If you stop working at 67, this is what you get, and 69. It was also almost like a psychological propaganda against people. Like every year you open this thing and you realize that if I go until 69, I'm going to get a lot of money. And then you hope that people over the decades should start updating and think that that's a good thing. And it has happened to some extent. So I think that could also be one part of the package.
Okay, so now we're going to turn to some of the things that can, lessen the negative trajectory that we have here. And one of them is pronatalist policies or pro-family policies. So actually try to, kick up fertility again in these countries. So if you look globally, these policies go everything from draconian things like restricting access to birth control and abortion, to incentives, financial incentives to have more children, to just pro-family policies that make it easier and more convenient to have children, raise children. Jesus, again, looking comparatively internationally, to what extent have such policies, are they finding a success, particularly the positive ones, incentives to have children or pro-family policies?
Okay.
No?
Yeah, so first of all, it's very difficult to tell. Okay, so let me tell you why this is, why economics is hard, because it's about the counterfactual. So we look at countries like France and we say, fertility is 1.7, despite the fact that they have this enormous fertility subsidies, fertility subsidies didn't work. It may have been the case that without them, they will be at 1.5. And that's very difficult to measure because you will need the counterfactual France that never applied those. Having said that, I have spent some amount of money trying to think about those counterfactuals, and I have spent some amount of time reading the literature. So let's think about children. Children are a big decision. You go from 0 to 1, or from 1 to 2, this is a fundamental change in your life. So if I'm going to give you $1,000, $2,000, $5,000, this is very unlikely to make any difference because that's not really what is the margin that makes an impact on your life. However, we know that cheap housing does make a huge difference. You are 25, you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, you are deciding to start a family, and you happen to live in Santa Barbara, and oh my God, the cheapest thing in the whole town is $1.5 million. You don't start a family. You are, I don't know, we were talking before about Miami or Texas. On Phoenix, the house, you can get a starter house for $300,000, you start a family. So I think that at this moment, the most important margin that we can play with, and I think there is quite a bit of good evidence, is cheap housing. And the good thing about cheap housing is we are not forcing anyone into anything. Okay, I'm just telling you, let's build houses. Look, I take a plane a lot of times to Texas, Austin, and Texas love to brag about how big Texas is. And I know that here in Minnesota, you're not big fans of Texas, but on this, Texans are right. Yeah. Texas is pretty big. You can actually feed the whole population of the whole planet in Texas with a single family house to each household. And you will still have Texas left. Okay? So let's build more. Let's just build more. You can build much more. And if we can lower the price of start homes in Philadelphia, I see a lot of empty space in Philadelphia. I see a lot of empty things that can be recycled into residential land in Pennsylvania. From 700 to 400, first of all, I think this will have a big effect on fertility. But even if it doesn't happen, so what? It's a good thing to do anyway.
So, well, maybe there's no answer to this, but obviously, unless it does have a positive effect on fertility, it's not going to turn around the situation or slow down the trajectory on. So what is the likelihood that a housing policy is going to have enough of effect on the fertility rate in the next 20 years to matter to this discussion?
Okay, so the way you want to think about this is compounding. Okay, so I go sometimes, I teach to the kids at Wharton because they pay really well. And the thing I tell the kids at Wharton is, look, how are you going to become filthy rich, which is the only thing they care about, with compounding, okay? You want to compound over time. That's the same thing with fertility. A fertility of 1.9 versus a fertility of 1.7 look very similar, but it is not. You run this over 50 years, it makes a huge difference. So we don't need to go from 1.6 to 2.1, even if that will be desirable. If we can go from 1.6 to 1.8, our fiscal problems in 50 years will look completely different. So I only need to push this 0.2 and right compounding. And I think the empirical evidence from many countries suggests that going to 1.8 with other complementary policies like more support for work-family balance is within the realm of possibility.
I just want to follow up on two things. So the first thing is like the size of the policies. And I sort of toyed around a bit with this myself because I was reading all these experiments, like we gave some money, nothing happened. And then I started calculating in Sweden, where we have very pro-family policies, like what's the total value of all these policies when you add them together? It's like all the healthcare, and then it's like 16 to 18 months of leave with 80% of pay, and then free daycare, or essentially free daycare, $100, $200 a month. And then, of course, just like in the US, schooling and then university. And you're talking about multiples of yearly income here. So I think that, yeah, that's true, that like there are these things are hard to make experiments on. I mean, Hungary, I guess, did push, but then you have the counterfactual. Then I also just want to agree completely with Jesus about the housing thing, that, you know, it's also very intuitive that kids are housing intensive. It's hard to have kids in a small place. It's easy to have kids in a big place. And that's something we can do something about. And then, can we do anything that changed the picture that I was talking about? Not that much in terms of fertility, because the workforce in 2060, you know, most people are already born. It's like, you know, you enter the workforce at 25 to 30. It's 35 years from now. If we start having more kids, it's not going to make an impact on the workforce until way, way later. So that's all what's, I think, interesting with study demography and taking that as a starting point for the future, that it's not everything. There are different scenarios that can happen, but at least it's a starting point where at least some things are baked in already from the beginning. That gives a good benchmark to then start reasoning from.
Immigration. So in 2025, the Congressional Budget Office said that without significant immigration, that the U.S. population would start to shrink in 2033, the magic number we talked about earlier today. Obviously, in the last year and a half since that report came out, immigration's policy and actions in the United States have been significantly deterring immigration to this country at all skill levels of various types. So Hannes, to what extent can immigration be part of the solution here for the United States?
I think on the margin, certainly. I mean, sorry, didn't get this to work. On the margin, certainly. I think that it needs to be pretty high, and I think that there is a common view that immigration and fertility are natural substitutes. We have less kids, so now we're going to have more immigration. I think we should also be open to the fact that it's actually often the reverse, because what people get upset with immigration is often the proportion of the population that is foreign-born. So if you have fewer kids, you can actually take in fewer immigrants before it becomes a very high share of the population. So if you look in the big immigration era of the US, actually the foreign-born share didn't really go that much above 15%. And that was just because the native population was having so much kids as well. So even though you brought in a lot of people, so I think that of course it would help on the margin, but it would have to be quite substantial. And I think that, like having more than 20, 30% seems to engender backlash a lot of the time. So I think that it can be part of the solution, not for the world, certainly, but maybe for the US, that is a popular country to go to, or used to be at least. Yeah, so that would be my view. So I think that that's a very important dimension. If you have a country like the US that has a welfare state, but also a very progressive tax system, clearly for the fiscal dimension, high-skilled immigration is much more good for the fiscal situation. So yeah.
Jesus.
Well, I basically agree with everything. So I did some careful numbers for most European countries, and let me be very, very careful, because I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression. When we are thinking about the right amount of immigration into a country, one needs to consider many issues, and it's a very complex topic. But for a second, let's think only about the fiscal impact of one additional immigrant. Because we live, as you were mentioning, in a welfare state with very progressive taxation, an immigrant that comes to the US with less than a college education is a net loss for the federal government. That's a fact. I mean, you may like it, you may not like it. You may say, well, that doesn't matter for my decision about how I'm going to vote on immigration. But if you bring someone to the US without a college education, you are not making your fiscal situation better off. Can we then bring more skilled immigrants? The answer is probably yes, but I think exactly subject to the point you are mentioning, that this needs to be within a reasonable degree of what a society can assimilate. And when you have very few kids, you also can assimilate less immigrants, because in some sense it's harder to socialize the new immigrants in the rules of society. And I'm very surprised how naive many of the discussions about immigration are without really looking at the cross-sectional evidence of many, many countries about the right amount of immigration that a country can have. So I think it will help. You know, I like immigration. I'm an immigrant. My wife is an immigrant. You're an immigrant. So I'm not against immigration. But we also need to be realistic about immigration. And then one very last final point, and I promise I don't go for too long. Where are these immigrants going to come from? Let me give you a very simple example. Net immigration from Mexico has been probably negative since around 2010. Around 1/3 of immigrants eventually go back to their countries of origin. Maybe after a few years, maybe when they get old. The big immigration from Mexico into the US was in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s. That immigration dropped drastically when fertility dropped in Mexico. And now there are more Mexicans going back to Mexico than Mexicans into the US. Now, of course, since a lot of these are non-documented moves, it's kind of hard to get the exact numbers. But you say, hey, but I see many people with funny names like Fernández Villaverde. Where are these coming from? Well, they are not Mexican. They are actually from Honduras, they are from Guatemala. And if you happen to be a native Spanish speaker like me, this is very easy to tell. It used to be the case that you will go to the Hispanic supermarket in Minneapolis and 99% of the food will be Mexican food. Today, if I go to the Hispanic restaurant in Minneapolis, I will bet you that 25% will be Venezuelan food and 25% will be Ecuadorian food. And that has completely changed the Hispanic community in the US from, maybe you Anglos, if I can say that, cannot really fully tell. And this is just going to happen as the fertility of Colombia and Venezuela goes down and Ecuador goes down. That's going to have the same effect. So who is going to migrate to the US in 2050 if those kids are not born?
Well, I was going to ask you some questions about the big, beautiful bill and its impact. And also we have this month the proposed fiscal 2027 federal budget. But I'm going to skip over that, and somebody in the Q&A can ask if they'd like, to talk about what's the implications for this for state governments, for Minnesota state government, for state governments. What would be your advice to policymakers at the state levels in light of what we're looking, when we're looking down the pike at this possible combination of federal policies coming towards them?
Yeah, I think that the first thing for the state governments is, of course, that Medicaid expenses are also very high among old people. Even though Medicaid is the one thing that is not only old people, there's also long-term care and nursing homes. So this will be something that's going to be important for state budget for that reason. The second thing I think for state budgets is just to sort of be very honest and look at the fiscal picture of the federal government, because of course there's very much, communication with how money gets sent in two directions. So state governments should just be ready that the federal government is probably about to get much more stingy soon, even though they don't say it now. So just be sort of mindful that you have to be ready that you will get less support from the federal government in the future, and SALT deductions and so on might also disappear. I mean, I think that that's like the general thing for the states, to be very aware of the austerity pressure that will exist at the federal level as well.
And this is This will be the last question before we throw it to the audience, so our folks with the microphones get ready. And Jesus already addressed this to some extent when talking about the division of those under 50 and over 50 in political alignments in Europe. But what are the implications of this for political discussions in the United States and political divisions in the United States over the next 30 years? If you'd like to speculate, although you're both immigrants.
Okay, so we are moving in all the Western world, and I would say in the rest of the planet as well, into what I call often zero-sum thinking. When the economy is not growing anymore, every dollar that I get is $1 that you don't. When the economy is growing at a 3%, there is money to give me $1 and there is money to give you $1. That makes the discussion much harder. Let me give you an example at the universities. When Penn is growing and the political science department can get one more line, the economics department can get two more lines, the sociology department can get one more line, you know, all of us in social sciences, we go to a meeting and, you know, oh, how is life, you know, your kid got into college, fantastic, you know, very lovely. Suddenly, no, the university says social sciences is going to grow zero, so every line that goes in economics is one line less in sociology. We go to the meeting of social sciences, and we don't ask about how your kid is doing in college. We basically enter into the room, you know, with a knife out. And that's a way to think about how a lot of politics is going to be about. We are going to go into the room with the knives out, about to stab anyone in front of us.
Where's our first question over here? The mic's coming towards you. Go ahead.
So I want to paint a slightly rosier picture. Coming as I'm also an immigrant here from Italy. So far, Italy has managed every time, much to my surprise, I have to say, to come back from the brink. And every time they brought in a very responsible government. So it looks like when you get an emergency, somehow Italy managed to get Ciampi, Dini, Monti, and Draghi. Three of these were central bankers. One of them was a very respected economist. They got a large majority. They got some things done. And as soon as the emergency was over, we got irresponsible people back in power. It worked for a while. We'll see long run. What's your view? Could that happen in the US?
No. Marco, you're getting this wrong. Italy didn't get a responsible government. The Germans told the Italians to get a responsible government, which is a different thing. No, you're in the European Union. Your degrees of freedom are very different.
No, that was the bond market.
Yeah, fine. And the ECB not backing. And the ECB not backing.
It's the old say, it's a bond market.
It's the bond market.
The bond market might visit the US too.
No, more seriously, yes, of course, at the end of the day, you know, I don't think we are going to go back to barbarity and the collapse of the Roman Empire and, you know, living in caves. The problem is, even if you eventually do the right thing, it may take you 20 years, it may take you 25 years of stagnation. And by the way, I don't know if you remember that table I showed you over there. I didn't want to mention Italy, but you guys haven't done that well over there. So, you know, yeah, you have Montis from time to time, but you have Melonis from time to time. And the problem is the percentage of Montis versus Melonis.
Where are two mics? Here's one mic. Yeah. Okay, there's a mic. Okay.
He's the boss.
So, I think you tried to scare us with that 12% sales tax in 2060 will solve the problem. That didn't seem particularly high to me. I mean, Sweden has 25%, and it's not like they're falling down. But more seriously, you guys did not touch on the type of reform I think that every country that has reformed the pension system has done, namely to increase instead of increasing taxes or lowering benefits per beneficiary, just increase the retirement age slowly. And it's always done 1 month per year. So people who are 50 today, they're not thinking too much, oh, am I going to retire in January or February, 12 years from now? It doesn't seem like a very important thing. Well, okay, so we do it 1 month per year for 12 years, so that gives us 1 year. It has a huge effect on fiscal policy, on the budget?
Yes. So first, is this a big thing with 12% sales tax? No, I think I tried to say a bit that no, it's not enormous, but it's pretty big. But it's actually, when you look at fiscal crisis in many countries, one thing that really strikes me is how little money it is about. If you take a country like Argentina, that has had persistent fiscal problems for decades, and then you look, what deficits are we talking about here? And it is a few percent of GDP, for the simple reason that if you're Argentina, you can't borrow that much. So the crisis started pretty early. They could never do what the US is doing, racking up 100% of GDP in debt very quickly. The bond market would revolt instantly. And that to me is a bit of a puzzle. If you say that, you're 2% down or 3% down, like how can you not just do a 5% higher labor income tax and then it's over forever? You're not going to have these inflationary bouts. You're just going to be fine. And there's this famous quote from David Copperfield with Mr. Micawber, who says that something will always show up. And he has this saying that if you spend 1 pence less than you earn, everything is perfect. If you spend 1 pence more than you earn, everything is misery. And that's true. And it's just surprising. I agree, it's not big money, but if you would try to go to Congress and get a 12% sales tax, it would not work. So that's the first thing. Then on the retirement age, I agree. And that would in some sense make it even more favorable. If you add in a fourth thing in the mix, not one single margin has to be pushed. But the standard now is that 300,000 to 400,000, everything below that is middle class and can't be taxed. But then I will go back to Marco's comment though about, will you get over this? And I have a friend who works at the IMF who's been working with many more countries in fiscal crisis than I have. And I talked to him a little bit about the demographic situation in the US. And I guess when you've seen a lot of cases, you become a bit jaded. And he said, everything is impossible until it's not. And I think that maybe that's what will happen in the US as well, that, when the bond market spooks out for real, then suddenly things will be possible very quickly. Or there will be a revolution, which is sometimes, what happens in fiscal crisis.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Jorge. I'm from Mexico. I'm a grad student here. And yeah, as Marco, Mexico has a history of irresponsible fiscal policy, and we actually defaulted. But in the 80s, we had the US to support us, right? And there were a lot of rescue packages and so on. So, but looking forward for the case of the United States, if there's more pressure to spend in the elderly, there's going to be more pressure, for example, to cut in defense, right? And if the demographic transition is actually going to bite, I'm more interested about the future geopolitical context. You talked a little bit about geopolitics, right? If China, India, these other countries become the predominant powers in the world, and if the US eventually defaults, do you think these other countries are actually going to rescue the US, or how do you see the political global landscape?
Okay, so coming back to my very brief comment before, I'm very pessimistic on the middle run for China. Okay, last year they had a little bit less than 8 million births. That means that China at current speed is about to lose more than 50% of its population. Their process of catch-up growth is coming up to a halt. I have another paper on the neoclassical growth of China that makes that point. I don't see things working very well in China in the year 2050. This basically means that the US faces a window of high danger because the Chinese leadership may be tempted to act before that window closes. If you actually look, and I spent a lot of time in my economic history undergraduate class at Penn on the decision process of the German elite of the Second Reich in the summer of 1914, it was really a fiscal crisis. The Second Reich had a number of fiscal institutions that didn't work very well. It had a lot of growing political pressures within the country, and the German elite thought that the only way forward to solve their problems was a war. And of course, they miscalculated that the German elite got kicked out. What really keeps me awake at night is not the US low fertility. I don't think that's a big deal at the end of the day, as we have already been saying. What keeps me awake at night is the leadership in Beijing in 2040, realizing that China is not going to be an important country in the year 2070, and that the only way we can break from that very pessimistic scenario is taking over Taiwan, because that will help us to break the first island barrier and exert dominance in all the East Asia and go for a little war. So I'm not worried about the US. The US will figure it out something. I'm worried about the war in Taiwan in the year 2040.
I think on more directly on your question, will countries save the US? The US is very hard to save because it is very, very big. And the US primary deficit is non-trivial, like as a share of the world economy. So I think that you should more think the reverse, actually. And when I discussed that a cash-strapped government becomes a wounded animal, that would probably be reflected in geopolitical relations as well, that buying US debt would be maybe a precondition for getting military support, or that you would try to use different means of coercion to get people to buy US debt at low interest rate. I mean, in some sense, you can say the tariff thing is a little bit like that, trying to get other countries' producers to pay US taxes more. And I think that if the US got into fiscal straits, the financial repression that is often directed domestically when it's like a country like Argentina could be directed internationally if it's a country like the US.
We have time for one or two more questions. Did you still have your question? A little bit, yeah. Yeah, here and then up there. Okay.
You guys have already been kind of touching on and talking about it a lot, but I'm an undergrad. We're a lot of young folks here as well. My question to you is, save Rome burning, barbarians at the gate, so on and so on. What is your most pessimistic expectation here? I know we've kind of been trying to avoid that, but I am a little worried, and I am. I know the U.S. We've seen we have a very long history of making bubbles that tend to pop, and I don't know that we can be bailed out. What do you guys expect?
What's the worst case scenario? I'm not putting a lot of probability on that scenario, but this is a useful exercise in stress testing. The fiscal policy becomes completely unsustainable. We run into a big inflation that creates a lot of unhappiness, and that leads to a complete breakdown of the constitutional order. That's exactly what happened in Germany in 1922. German 1922 has a very big fiscal problem. They don't want to face that fiscal problem. They have a hyperinflation, and the hyperinflation, it takes 11 years to work through the system, but you have the let me say it in English. February 1st, the NSDAP in 1933 gets to power. That's the worst case scenario. At the end of the day, the problem is high inflations completely destroy economic systems, completely destroy political systems, but high inflations are very tempting for politicians.
I would sort of echo that and just fill out a little bit when I discussed my bad scenario, when I said the type of regulations that the government would impose, that they try to force people to buy debt. What happens is that if you just can't do that little thing of just doing 5%, the government that are cash-strapped has a habit of making their problem everyone's problems. And that would lead to a very strong politicization of the economy. Because if you have inflation, and then someone says that Walmart is being greedy, we have to cut food prices. And then they put a cap on food prices. Then you get shortages. Then you have to start regulating who should get rations to food. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's what's happening is that you start regulating, and then a lot of decisions that were formally in the private arena moves into the political arena, and that sharpens the conflict in general. I think that's a very big risk. And I think also on the disappointment that fiscal crisis is that what really keeps me up at night, I guess, is that the US is a country where a lot of people feel badly treated by the man, by society. Some people feel that I'm paying taxes to people who should work harder. Other people feel that the benefits you get from VA or Medicare are stingy. And then when I look at the figures and I realize that this is what people feel when we use a lot of debt to paper over the issues, that we're actually giving more generous benefits and charging lower taxes than what it actually costs to sustain the system. Then I get worried about the ability to the US to say that you're actually going to get a more raw deal. The happy days are behind you. The thing that you thought was bad was actually good. Now the real bill comes due. And I don't know how Americans would handle that in the political arena.
Final question up here.
A quick question, kind of turning to the U.S. states. Have you done any studies on comparing U.S. states? So you've talked about Texas, and certainly there's been a lot of growth in Texas, a lot of economic growth, and certainly in Minnesota, we've seen some reversal in some of our trends, slower growth, and maybe some projections even of decline in the future, and certainly that will impact the capacity for government expenditures. Where Texas may have more capacity in the future, Minnesota may have a lower capacity in the future, and certainly we've had a generous state. We've had growth in government spending. Have you done any research into some of those trends, either with fertility rates, but also just demographic growth rates and the long-term stability of states and their capacity to deal with those changes?
The direct answer is no, but I think it's such an important issue. I've spent a little bit time thinking about it in the context of Europe, because in Europe you have that many of the peripheral economy, people are moving to Germany, to the central countries, and that's sort of how it should be, in the sense that we reallocate labor to more productive uses. But I've been thinking about what the long-run consequences will be for the pension systems in countries like Portugal, when all the young people are leaving and the old people stay, and whether the next crisis facing the European Union will be that they have to make the pension system federal as well, or something like that. There has to be a bailout of the pension system And of course, in the US, a lot of those things are already federal, so in that sense, there's less pressure. But of course, it still happens, and I think it's a very important question. On the states, the interesting question for the states is that education will actually get cheaper when we stop having kids. So that's a silver lining for the states that's not there for the federal government. But no, I haven't done it. It's such an important question. I think that, I or someone else should do it. Listen, students in the audience.
30 seconds. I promise I will be very fast. So Pennsylvania, Penn State was forced to close 11 of their satellite campuses recently. And those are the type of tough decisions you need to make.
So as Shuttle goes to the podium to conclude, I just want to say that, particularly for the young people in the audience, hope, where does hope lie? Hope lies in our agency as human beings. Economists are into agency, right? Okay? And agency means that starts with understanding, obtaining the knowledge and understanding, and then taking actions in our political lives and our professional and our political choices to move us in the direction of policies that are going to be most effective at addressing these things in as timely manner as possible. So that's where our hope is. And so back to you, Shuttle.
Thank you to Professors Malmberg and Fernández Villaverde, and to Dr. Bunn for this engaging and I think really interesting discussion. We should have more of this stuff. But unfortunately, our time is up. I encourage all of you to go on the website of the Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute, and there's more material. There are podcasts. This event is going to be available also as a podcast, and it's also on YouTube, etc., and Spotify. Please join us for. Let's continue this discussion. Outside, there is actually some food there. In addition, there are a bunch of a number of undergraduates have written theses supported by the Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute, and they present their stuff there. I encourage you to go and talk with them and learn some stuff. Thank you.